I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, one of your co-hosts.
I'm Matt Bernico, your other co-host, and just one of a ragtag group of bank robbers ready to set the world right with my big heist I'm doing with my friends. That's right, folks. New episodes of Money Heist came out this week, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, so many hours. 5 hours exactly, I think, of content, and there's going to be 5 more in December, so it's just enough of a cliffhanger at the end to make you feel like you're really watching the show. I appreciate that.
Yeah, for people who don't listen to our Behind the Paywall podcast, we are big fans of the show Money Heist, which is a great, mostly anti-capitalist show about bank robbers, and it does rule. So get out there and watch this one with us. I'm sure we'll talk about it probably more times than we should in this podcast.
Yeah, it is very good, and you'll learn Spanish as you go, so that helps.
See.
This time around, though, we are not talking about Money Heist or La Casa de Papel, as they say in Spain. Instead, we are talking about climate change still. We can't stop thinking about it, and there have been some good articles and things that Matt and I have just been reading and talking about back and forth, so we thought, why don't we just talk about it in front of a microphone and see what happens? Just like a few weeks ago, we said that we were just going to start and see where we get by the end of the conversation. I think we're doing that this time around as well, but we do have some ideas about it. So a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the IPCC report that was spelling out the bad news of climate change and impending disaster. And we were kind of doomers about it. It was a bummer of an episode. We felt bummed at the end of it. And this week, we are coming back to climate change and some of the apocalyptic consequences to think a little bit more critically about the terms that surround that problem, and also how we can think through, I don't know, maybe possible solutions, but more accurately, ways of thinking about solutions. I want to qualify it.
Yeah, you need to know how to think about possible solutions before you can even come with one solution.
Yeah. I want to move us back so far in the steps of this process. So we don't have any big solutions to the climate, but maybe if we can think about the ways that capitalism is tied into climate crisis, we can think a little more clearly about how to approach thinking about politics in the midst of climate change. And, it's we've got it all. We've read a monthly review article that helped us put our brain together. I've been rereading Pope Francis's Laudato Si. So, surprise, surprise. There's actually some very good stuff in there. So we'll get to all that. But Matt, where should we start? What's the point of entry for this big conversation?
It's hard to figure out exactly where to start because climate change is such a big problem, and figuring out, exactly where the problem lies is part of thinking about the problem. This is the backpedaling. This is the moving 5 steps back to even take a look at what the actual issue is that we were talking about. We think we know what the problem is, that it's anthropogenic climate change. It's people releasing carbon into the air, into the I don't even know, the air, the sky, up in the big blue that people love so much. We're putting too much carbon up there, right?
Yeah, the big blue's turning into the big brown, and you don't want that.
That's right, and that makes the Earth heat up, right? That's all there. But people rarely think very critically about the unequal distribution of blame and consumption patterns for the emissions of carbon. That is maybe the point of entry to this episode, this discussion that we're going to have here. Like, liberalism generally assumes that global capitalism's promise of freedom is to bring everyone up to the developmental habits of countries like the United States and Canada, like North America. But scientists say that if everyone in the world consumed like we do, we would need several Earths to sustain it. So that's maybe the point of entry, right? We think the problem is just people doing things to the Earth, and then that creates climate change, which is true. But it's not just like a random group of people doing things to the Earth. It's a real specific organization of people that are doing things to the Earth that then cause the problems of climate change. Like, what we're talking about is capitalism, right? I mean, like, that's the whole thing. So I think that, like, maybe the place to start is analyzing the terms of the problem a little bit more clearly, so that we can kind of like find, I mean, for the this is maybe a bad way to put it, but you can find like the right people to blame for the problem. Putting it that way, I guess, makes me think of this thing that one of my, I don't know, favorite folk musicians, Utah Phillips, has said many times. Utah Phillips has this thing that he says that about patterns of blame, and how that's actually really important to understanding society and the way that it works. So Utah Phillips has this thing where he says, all of us assign blame in our own best interest. And if we assign blame in our own best interest, that means that the blame is relative. And if blame is relative, then one of the important functions of society becomes who controls the blame patterns. And for Utah Phillips, he was always cognizant of the ways that, when push came to shove, it was really the people at the very bottom of the social pyramid, the people like the people who were scamming welfare or something at the very bottom, trying to get a little bit of something for nothing. But Utah Phillips always reminds us that actually, if you flip it and you think, well, you need to think about the people who are getting a lot of something for nothing, the billionaires and trillionaires at the top. And that's like, why do we assign blame downward rather than upward? I think that's actually a really important thing to consider as we are thinking about anthropogenic climate change or climate disaster, or whatever words we want to use, I guess. But we think that the problem is with everybody doing things, but actually, it's with the ways that capitalism has arranged certain groups of people to consume, massive amounts of everything that create carbon and do all kinds of other things. So I think that might be the place to start, is kind of understanding that pattern of blame and coming to do a deeper analysis, a more critical analysis that actually finds the people and systems that you ought to really hold accountable.
Yeah, I think that is a good place to start. And maybe we can even take a minute and talk through how people have tried to name that phenomenon that you're talking about, people changing the planet. The big word is Anthropocene. That is a fancy word. If you've never heard it before, congratulations.
You've never been to grad school, I guess.
Yeah.
Lucky for you.
Yeah. It's sort of the prefix is anthropos, right? Humanity. And the assumption is, just like we had other sort of geological periods in the Earth's history that are defined by a number of different phenomena. I forget what they are. I don't know. Heliocene is one of them, I think.
The Holocene is like the recent.
The Holocene. That's what I'm thinking. Different ways in which the Earth changes or it sort of takes different shapes depending on big variables. And the big revolutionary moment is that now humans are kind of in the driver's seat of those changes, that humans have become the primary cause of changes on the planet and changes that are happening very rapidly.
Yeah.
Do you want to pause there? We can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's actually a really big part of the situation. Like, again, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a geologist. So I'm really doing a little bit of talking on my butt here. But I I feel like there's something really important to that, right? Like, when it comes to naming previous geological epochs, we talk about like what rocks are doing, right? Like, that's it. Like, what's in the fossil record of a particular time or something. And with the Anthropocene, it's when humans and human action is kind of is influencing geological time. And I think that is the part that is like, I mean, a little bit scary if you think about it, where people are, like the Industrial Revolution, the the advent of like nuclear energy and like the proliferation of plastic everywhere, right? These are the traces of anthropogenic change and effect on the earth that are being like left behind. That's like, you know, once eventually some kind of big volcano comes and kills us and covers over all of our cities, future aliens will be looking underneath it all and they'll find all this plastic and they'll be like, ah, the Anthropocene, that was them, right? But that's like that's the perspective we're talking about. But like we were saying though, the Anthropocene is not like it's not symmetric in its in its causes or something. It's not like equally you know, not every single person is equally at blame for it, I suppose.
Yeah, right. Or like, not every person on the planet is affecting the climate to the same degree or with the same amount of power or with the same amount of agency, for instance. And that's really important too. I should pause here to say, so, okay, the basic term is the Anthropocene. That's kind of the common term that people use to describe just that generic fact that human beings are changing the planet. But as you can guess, there are all kinds of other terms that have been suggested as ways of complicating it and maybe assigning blame in different ways. And we can talk through them more, at least one of them in a minute, kind of relying on that monthly review article that we'll sort of introduce everybody to, whether they like it or not, shortly. But people have sort of tried to locate the precise moment at which humans become the drivers of that change. And, you know, it is tied, if you're not an anti-capitalist still, it is usually tied to the Industrial Revolution. Not always, some people locate it elsewhere, but it's pretty clear that that's a turning point in human history in terms of our relationship to the environment. Other people will locate it a little bit further back. Like there are some people who do work on race who talk about the Plantation-ocene or something like that, right? That there's something about the sort of anti-blackness that is constitutive of capitalism that also feeds into the way that we treat the planet. Some people talk about the Cthulhu-cene. There's a lot of wild stuff going on there. But I think what all these different terms are trying to get at is that Anthropocene, as a kind of neutral term, can actually obscure those power differentials and power relations. And it's important to parse out who's really in the driver's seat of climate change.
Yeah, it really is. Man, it's actually cool that you bring up the Cthulhu-cene because that is, I think, another helpful idea in this vein of thinking. I don't want to divert our our conversation too much, but that's a phrase or a term coined by Donna Haraway, who is like one of these very fascinating Marxist feminists, but like fall into this other category of kind of like post-humanist thinkers. Anyways, it has a lot to do with like the tentacular and the ways that human and non-human are really interconnected in this world. But that's a whole nother story, man. Just maybe all I'm trying to say here is it's a good book recommendation or something. It's a wild book. There's a great video for talking about it too. Anyways, yeah, let's talk about the Anthropocene a little bit more, and maybe this other suggestion from the monthly review, the Capitalocene or the Capitalinian. Not great words here, folks. These people are geologists, they're social scientists, they're not marketers. They're not doing a good job coming up with great messaging and branding, but it's fine. We'll roll with it. So in the most recent issue of the monthly review, a magazine that we like to talk about endlessly, the cover story by John Bellamy Foster is called The Capitalinian, and it's kind of tackling this problem that we're dealing with right now about the different powers and the different scales of influence that different people and systems might have on the environment. And let's just take a look at some of the things in this essay that might be helpful to kind of get a handle on thinking on like the grand problem of humans impacting the environment, because it is a big one. So this is one place to start thinking with that essay. So John Bellamy Foster, he writes this. In this view, the prefix anthro in the word Anthropocene is often interpreted as simply having a human biological dimension while lacking a socioeconomic and a cultural one. As one post-humanist critic has charged, not only the notion of the Anthropocene, but even the phrase anthropogenic climate change is a special brand of blaming the victims of exploitation, violence, and poverty. Okay, so I think that's actually a really helpful point as just a jumping off point. That's anthropogenic is a word that is maybe in some okay, it's referring to the ways that humans, how climate change started with human, like anthropogenic, right? The genesis of climate change is with humans. And that's true, but what John Dolly Foster is saying here is really important because it might end up kind of being victim blamey. That the people who are most exploited by violence, by the violence of capitalism, it might be unfair to blame them for all of the climate change, right? Why would you blame, I don't know, like workers in a factory or whatever when it's, they're being coerced into doing those things. So you have to kind of think about it in maybe a slightly different register.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, things get even more and more complicated when we scale up to the level of global capitalism and how this all feeds into, workers in the global south, for instance. But I think just to sort of stick with your example of workers at a factory, right? Like, you kind of get this rhetoric sometimes around like dirty industries, right? Like coal mining. That's the one I always think about. Coal is very bad. Like we shouldn't be burning it. Nevertheless, there are like entire towns that are built around the premise of people working in coal mines, right? And like successive generations of families who have built their lives as sort of related to that industry. A bunch of them have been on strike in Alabama, right? Like, it's a big deal. And the trouble is, nobody should be burning coal. But nevertheless, these are proletarianized workers, right? People who have to sell their labor in order to survive because our society doesn't know what else to do with human beings in an intentional way other than to compel them to work in whatever sort of job they can possibly find. Otherwise, you'll go hungry or not be able to pay your rent or whatever. And I think that's really significant too, that of course coal mining contributes to climate change. And coal miners, as a result of pulling coal out of the earth to be burned, they too contribute to climate change. But they do so because we have a global capitalist system that compels them to work and also does not have any interest in finding other alternatives that may not be as profitable as something like coal mining. So it's important to recognize that, yes, are they human beings contributing to climate change? Yes, but like not in the same way that, people who don't make decisions about energy at the political level are contributing to climate change.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Something else that came to mind for me when we were kind of getting through this was this is like a really niche example that kind of I don't know, pulls the problem out a bit more. But I don't know, I saw a documentary about it once, so I guess I have grounds to talk about it. In 1984, there was this thing in Bhopal, India, called the Bhopal disaster. This chemical plant that was there that's owned by Union Carbide, which is now owned by a company called Dow Chemical, which is something to think about that still exists in the United States. It's a real company that doesn't really give a shit about this. Anyways, all that to say, the Bhopal disaster was this gas leak in 1984 that ended up spreading pesticides to all of these workers who worked at this particular plant in Bhopal, India. And it is like one of the, I don't know, like the worst industrial disasters I think probably ever. Something like, man, I'm trying to think of the exact number. Like 500,000 people were like exposed to these pesticides, and it leached into like the groundwater and has all kinds of like compounding environmental effects on top of that. And even today, people in Bhopal still kind of like deal with the fallout and like birth defect and all kinds of things like that. And it's like it's such a wild thing because it's held up as an industrial disaster that had huge ramifications for local ecology, right? But it's not like those people can be held responsible necessarily, right? It's like it's this company that put them in this position where they're going to work in some place that isn't safe, doing something that is like, I don't know, I guess in some ways maybe necessary for like, I don't know, farming or something, but still it's like you can't blame the wrong people, I guess, in these types of situations. And I think that's a really important point when we're talking about anthropogenic climate change, because it's anthropogenic, but like you have to recognize that there is a particular system and logic and ideology behind the system that is like creating the problem, and it's not necessarily workers. It's not
Right.
it's not people who are like putting their lives on the line to make very little money. It's not their fault necessarily.
Yeah. Um, so, the spoiler here is, of course, the problem is capitalism. It's always capitalism, so on and so forth. We'll get to that in a minute. Before we do, though, I also think it's important to take a minute to say, yes, global capitalism is the primary kind of driver of this, but we'll find out. It is not as so simple as to say, well, and communism is just kind of the answer, right? Because the big wrinkle in blaming only capitalism is that countries that have become communist also rapidly industrialized and are still industrializing in ways that are not sustainable and not good for the environment. And that sort of, I think, gives a little bit of credence to the idea of calling it the Anthropocene, for example, or at least kind of doing the Capitalocene with sort of an asterisk on it, or saying, I guess you could sort of, if you really wanted to be like pedantic about it, you could say, well, perhaps communist countries wouldn't need to industrialize so rapidly if they weren't competing with capitalist nations around the world. And of course, you'd be right. But still, there are kind of independent industrial logics embedded in Marxism in particular, and communism too, that sort of compel, I think, people who are in a communist or socialist tradition to spend a lot of time reflecting critically on how those situations have also contributed to bad ways of human beings, human beings changing the environment in really bad ways.
Yeah, it's a really good note, for sure, that there's more to the story than just capitalism, but I don't know, capitalism is also pretty egregious.
It's the main one, I think. No matter what,
it's the main bad
primary
one. That's
Yeah.
true. I mean, there's something to be said though that there's like a larger story here about the ways that humans comport themselves towards nature, towards non-human
Right.
creatures or whatever. I think that's a really important discussion, just the same. Man, cool. Well, here's another quote to maybe get us back on track in targeting capitalism specifically. So, in the monthly review, again, John Bellamy Foster writes this: the epicenter for such global environmental disruptions has been the United States as the hegemonic power of the capitalist world economy, dominating and characterizing this entire period. In our analysis, the economic and social system of the United States thus epitomizes the Capitalinian, as no other nation has played a bigger historical role in the promotion of a poverty of power represented by fossil capital. So this is getting to kind of the crux of the argument here that sure, anthropogenic climate change is a descriptive term, but you can't just think that like everyone is sort of equally responsible or like has equal sort of pull over fixing the problem. Even that there is specific people who are responsible. Again, another Utah Phillipsism that the people destroying our planet do have names and addresses.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Let me read a little bit more on here about the Capitalinian, and then we can have a different kind of conversation about it. So this is kind of the in the monthly review article. This is kind of setting the table more to talk about this thing called the Capitalinian. So at the start of what we call the Capitalinian, global monopoly capital rooted within the United States entered a period of massive expansion fueled by the rebuilding of Europe and Japan, the petrochemical revolution, the growth of the automobile complex, suburbanization, the creation of new household commodities, militarization and military technologies, the sales effort, and the growth of international trade, with the endless quest for profit spurring the accumulation of capital, production, and the material throughputs to support the economic system's operations have greatly expanded, placing more demands on ecosystems and generating more pollution. I include this like second chunk here. It is a bit long-winded, but it is important because it is just like it's kind of giving you a bullet list of all of the things that capitalism is explicitly doing that kind of plays up this its responsibility for climate crisis. If you want to know if it's anthropogenic climate change, then these are the anthropogenics that you need to be looking at right here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the particular anthropogenics. It's important to put it that way for sure.
Right.
Yeah. So all that to say, I guess just to kind of tie this up, this little bit of the conversation, maybe like it's true. Human beings are changing the environment, and it is mostly capitalism's fault. I mean, like overwhelmingly capitalism's fault. I think we can say that pretty safely. And we can also, I think, say that whatever faults may exist within communism, and they are real and so on with respect to ecology and socialism as well, the fact of the matter is capitalism is a system that internal to itself can't really solve this problem, that it's only really going to be able to exacerbate it. And that should compel us to seek some kind of other alternative. Maybe before we get to what that alternative is, though, it might be good to keep drilling down into how capitalists think about the world around them, or sort of how they miss this, I think. Like, I always think of, you mentioned earlier, Matt, like liberalism kind of has this dream of raising everybody around the world up to the living standards of people in the US or Canada or Europe or whatever. And that is like literally impossible, right? There's a hard ecological limit to that dream. Like everyone on the world cannot have a cell phone. The world like can't sustain 7 billion cell phones at one time. So liberalism applies this kind of like humanitarian dream of industrial development and consumption that you find in North America and Europe to other countries. And this is a problem in liberal solutions to cutting carbon emissions because it puts people in so-called developing countries on the hook for climate change, right? It's like, well, we have to be able to get whoever it might be, Bolivia or something, up to our standards of consumption, but also they have to do it in a way that is like clean and, not like the way that we did it and so on because of climate change. So you end up with this kind of strange double standard where, like, on the one hand, there's this demand to raise the global south up to the level of the global north, and also this recognition that you could never repeat what the global north did to get to that point. And again, just sort of ignoring that it would be impossible to distribute all that evenly as well. So I guess you could say, like, I think liberals in the global north basically fail to recognize that, like, their own ability to enjoy their standard of living is precisely because so-called developing countries are poor and exploited historically, and the environment is also exploited historically, right? That, like, liberalism sort of in these countries rests on this foundation of ecological degradation and economic exploitation, which is a really tough ideology to crack.
Yeah, that's right. There's also, I think, a flip side to this too, where sometimes liberalism will. Okay. So I think that first of all, the diagnosis you're giving here, I think, makes complete sense. Though the other direction that sometimes liberalism can think about this, especially amongst progressives, is like, what's the answer to climate change in the United States, in North America? And we get things like the Green New Deal, which, a great effort, I suppose, but does have, a lot of problems with it. Like, you know, can we all have rechargeable electric cars, or
Right.
Can we all have solar panels or whatever other types of like advanced sort of green battery energy storing techniques? And it's like that's the answer, says something like the Green New Deal. That's like the progressive answer. But on the other hand, to like get those things, you need to like plunder so-called developing countries for the resources they have, like lithium or copper or whatever. Um, I just heard. I heard the most absurd thing on NPR a few days ago, where they were talking about the United States. They just pulled out of Afghanistan, and isn't that great? And now all of these developers are asking, like, okay, cool, the war is over, but like, when can we get back in to get the
Right.
lithium out of Afghanistan? And it's like, okay, it's like in the industrial production of the United States needs to change to be more sustainable, but it will do so at the expense of like industrializing and like destroying other countries as well,
Mhm.
right? Like, so there is this one sense that like, Bolivia or whatever, it's a country that has a lot of lithium. They have to do their whole industrialization in a very eco-friendly, green way, but at the same
Mhm.
time, like, the global north, like requires them to like supply them with all of the things that they need for you know electric cars and stuff. So there's like this wild double standard between all of it.
Right. And kind of building on that too, the historical concentration of wealth in the global north, which is an effect of the sort of sucking out of wealth from the global south. That too sets up this weird imbalance where like global north countries are sort of free to like imagine how and when they would like to greenify their economies or whatever. But like I was just reading, I don't know, maybe I talked about this on the Lock-In podcast, I can't remember, but there was an article that came out about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which they loan a bunch of money to countries in the global south in really exploitative ways. In light of the pandemic, they were saying, they want to launch all these new sort of financial initiatives, and a lot of them would be tied to incentives around greenifying economies in the global south, which like sounds like a great idea, right? Like, and in a basic sense, it is like everybody should have a green economy. But the IMF historically has it gives out money with like very strong strings attached, right? So it will be like, we'll give you this money to do this thing that we want you to do because we think it's very good for you. And in return, you have to like, gut like all your public health care or
Right.
like make sure that
talked about this in the past when we talked about like structural adjustment programs.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah, or it'll be like, one way, for instance, that they would encourage green development is by giving like kickbacks to international green companies, right? Like solar panel companies or something, which there's all kinds of stuff with that. Like they might clear, for instance, like indigenous land to install solar panels and so on. So there's this real continued colonialism, but like green this time, right? And I mentioned I've been reading Laudato Si, so surprise, surprise, I'm going to bring Papa Francesco into this one. Because surprisingly or not, he is attentive to this in his own way of thinking ecologically. So I just coincidentally had come across this passage when we were thinking about this episode. Francis says, the foreign debt of poor countries has become a way of controlling them, yet this is not the case where ecological debt is concerned. In different ways, developing countries, where the most important reserves of the biosphere are found, continue to fuel the development of richer countries at the cost of their own present and future. The land of the southern poor is rich and mostly unpolluted, yet access to ownership of goods and resources for meeting vital needs is inhibited by a system of commercial relations and ownership which is structurally perverse. The developed countries ought to help pay this debt by significantly limiting their consumption of non-renewable energy and by assisting poorer countries to support policies and programs of sustainable development. I think the last bit is wishful thinking, perhaps on Pope Francis's part, but nevertheless, I mean, he's absolutely right to point out, right, that like rich countries are sort of able to enjoy the plunder of poor countries, and poor countries don't get anything back in return. So all they do get is like the offer of potential loans from like the IMF that will inevitably ensure that wealth continues to get sucked out of their countries, and they don't develop in the ways that they perhaps feel that they need or should develop.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's such an important thing to note the imperialism of all of it, because, like, I mean, okay, it's a current problem that is with us, but it also sets the tone for like how capitalism will inevitably deal with climate change. And like you said, Dean, like capitalism can't, right? Like it can't figure out how to deal with a changing climate within itself, because like it's not within its logic to do so. It's not a capacity that capitalism has. But like noting the imperialism of the situation, I think is a really great outline for the ways that capitalism trends when kind of like pushed in these directions, like trending towards like fascism. I think is it securing its own resources for countries in the global north is probably the future, right? Like that's capitalism dealing with climate change. It's just it's cracking down and like guarding the border, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And tying in that imperialism piece is important too, because we were saying, you can complicate Anthropocene in a number of ways, and maybe talking about it in a Capitalinian way is one way of doing that. But again, it's like you can also find a way of talking about it that emphasizes the imperialist nature of all that, right? That
right.
you don't get the sort of big anthropogenic climate change that we have just because like the factories of England are finally getting going in the 1900s or something. It's like you get it because Europeans decided to colonize the world and then sort of reshape the entire planet in ways that are not ecologically sustainable because it is in the service of capital accumulating capital rather than human beings living healthy lives and so on. So tying imperialism into that is, again, just like a necessary piece in the same way that pointing out the anti-blackness at the heart of all of this is necessary, in the same way that pointing out our metabolism with the earth in an ecological way is a necessary piece. All that kind of stuff sort of fits in. But yeah, the imperialism piece is important because you often get a lot of green rhetoric that is totally inattentive to how these sort of lofty ideals actually end up meeting real human beings, especially marginalized people in other countries.
Yeah, that's right. It's a really good a good note to make. You can't just understand it. I mean, you can't just like solve climate change with like maintaining the sort of same patterns of production and consumption. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, well, we can turn maybe to the solution potentially in just a minute, but one other piece that I just thought I'd bring out here that kind of continues on the same lines. I always think about the development of ecologically disastrous economies in the U.S. and Canada and Europe, colonial powers, as being it's so fascinating in a perverse way because these countries are consuming at rates that are staggering, and like I'm part of it, right? Like I consume in this country too. And that consumption is so wild because like it is based on a historical process that cannot be repeated. Like we could never, if everything that we know in our society today was like wiped out and people had to start from scratch tomorrow in however long it took them to discover like fossil fuels and stuff, they would not have enough oil to like redo what we have done already. And in addition to that, other economies that are growing up now around colonial powers, especially China, but you could think of other ones too. There's all kinds of debates at like big international summits and so on around like what should these countries do, what's their responsibility, and that sort of thing. What's really fascinating is like certainly every country in the world has a responsibility to develop in a way that is healthy and survivable or something like that. But speaking of the monthly review, I was just rereading another article in there from July, an article called China, Imperialism or Semi-Periphery by, I don't know, I can't find the author right now. In any case, it's a good article. You should read it. It talks about trying to figure out if China is imperialist or not. And I don't know, you can make up your mind whether or not it's convincing. But one piece in it that I thought was really interesting, supported by all kinds of graphs and so on, was this argument that China could not become part of the kind of imperialist core in the way that the usual core countries are, because to do so would require extracting not only like massive amounts of labor from other countries in the world, just like those colonial powers do, but it would have like an ecological cost that would not be sustainable. Like the Earth could not host China reaching the same sort of imperialist levels as other countries on the planet. And I think that's really important, too, to sort of keep emphasizing that capitalism is the problem, because it's the countries who got to capitalism first that remain uniquely responsible, forever for climate change. Like other countries couldn't even get to that level of sort of sin or destruction, even if they tried.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, as always, say what you will about China, but I think that is a pretty helpful provision, or at least a good way to think about it. Just kind of like the, well, I mean, not the accident of like fossil fuels and imperialism, like the planned extraction of fossil fuels and imperialism from other countries. But yeah, I mean, a helpful way to kind of handle thinking about I don't know, certain ideas of the future, especially with like anti-Chinese sentiment and stuff like that going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's pivot the conversation a little bit more. So far, what we've got is climate change. It's still bad. We've discovered it's bad. It's not good. We don't like it. The phrase Anthropocene, though, carries a lot of complications. Like which anthros are pocening this whole place up? That it's not all of us, right? I mean, like I don't. I want to be clear here too. We're not making this claim about the Anthropocene and kind of complicating it to sort of get out of our own culpability in it, because that's not the case,
Yeah.
for sure. But it is like I think it is bringing a certain type of correction to the way of thinking about anthropogenic climate change. That it's like, it relies on the proletarianization of the masses. That there's not like an equal power distribution in that. Like, I mean, even in North America, I mean, even though we are consuming here and we're driving cars and we're honking our horns and whatnot, um, the power that we have to kind of push and pull on the climate situation is like very different than were we Dow Chemical or something like that, right?
Right.
We can all be planeteers in our own way, and that's great. We should. But there are a whole lot of like other people kind of weighing in on the situation that prohibits our power and kind of maybe blocks some of that power without serious organizing. But to think through to think through a perspective about like what the future could be like, were we to think about it differently. The monthly review, the same article here about the Capitalinian, is also offering an alternative future to maybe help us think about things, which is always nice. I appreciate that when people outline the bleakness of reality, but say it could be different. That's great. It could be, and it's not right now, and that's the problem. But the word that they go with here is one that I'm again not thrilled about the messaging, the marketing on, but the communion. So if there's the Capitalinian, the one where capitalism is sort of at the heart of these anthropogenic climate change, there's the communion that could be maybe the answer to it. So let me read a big block of text from the monthly review again, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. The advent of the communion, or the geological age of the Anthropocene to succeed the Capitalinian, barring an end Anthropocene extinction event. So the communion is what comes after the Capitalinian, unless we all die first. That's the big thing here. Anyways,
Right.
This necessitates an ecological, social, and cultural revolution, one aimed at the creation of collective relations within humanity as a whole as a basis for a wider community with the earth. It thus requires a society geared both substantive equality and ecological sustainability. The conditions for this new relation to the earth were eloquently expressed by Marx, writing in the 19th century, of course, in what is perhaps the most radical conception of sustainability ever developed. Marx writes this: from the standpoint of higher socioeconomic formation, socialism, the private property of particular individuals in the earth will appear just as absurd as the private property of one man and other men, which is slavery. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations as good heads of the household. So, in the view of the ancient Greek materialist Epicurus, John Bellamy Foster ends this essay saying that the world is my friend. So, this is a different perspective. Like, if the Capitalinian is this whole logic that got us into, the problem in the first place, and it's exacerbated the problem, and it has absolutely no possible way of solving the problem, the communion is what has to come after the fact. Or it's one possibility, right? We could either all die, or maybe we'll become communists. It's one of the two. It has this different sort of perspective about the ways that humans should engage with the earth and thinking about it itself in relationship with the earth. Maybe I don't know, the Epicurean thing at the very end about the world's my friend is maybe a good summation of it, right? It's kind of understanding that the world is not to possess as private property, but to be a beneficiary of, and to do something good with it.
Right. Yeah, I think too it's interesting to pull that out because, JBF, John Bellamy Foster, he he mentions he calls that sort of posture of Marx the most radical conception of sustainability ever developed. But he forgets that it was not developed by Marx, but actually comes to him, I think, by way of the Christian tradition, right? Like, you think of like the Diggers, or I mean, we talked about this just recently when we were talking about Saint Francis. That there's this conception that the earth is God's, and therefore nobody can really possess it, right? As Gerard Winstanley, one of the Diggers, this radical English reformer, said when rich people were trying to build fences to keep poor people out, you can't do that, right? That they should destroy those fences. They should level them, dig them up, dig them out of the ground, because it's an affront to God to sort of claim that you could possess that in a private way. And I think it's important for Christians to recover that sort of deep pulse of the Christian sort of radical message as well. I think, talking about branding, like it is hard to get Christians to think about communism for a lot of reasons, some of them bad and some of them totally understandable, I think, given history. But like, there is this kind of communism that is so ingrained in the Christian tradition that is a contributor to the kind of thing that John Bellamy Foster is rightly arguing for, right? A kind of communion, a communitarian way of being together, which is really the only way out of something like capitalism. Like, it's only when you kind of break the addiction to private property that you could ever imagine a world where you wouldn't need more and more and more of it, I think. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, Christians, I think, should really take that as a signal that, we have our own ways of kind of getting into that dialogue with Marxism.
Yeah, I think it's a really good note. Okay, I don't want to go off on a whole nother tangent because I think I have a lot of things to say about like the Anthropocene and sort of private property. But a lot of my work in grad school had a lot to do with the idea of the Anthropocene and like the particular pathologies that humans have, I mean, enabled by capitalism, that, make our modes of being in the world so oriented towards like possessing in the sense of private property. But yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly right. Like, Christianity does have this. I mean, it's not necessarily always present in the Orthodox institutional church, but it is definitely like an undercurrent, if not like an overcurrent, in some forms of Christianity that says that property ultimately belongs to God, and again, like we are the beneficiaries of it or something. The not to hold dominion over, but to possess gently or something. And yeah, man, I think that's such an important thing. Like, if you want to really start thinking about ecology differently, you have to like sort of displace yourself as the sort of sole proprietor of the earth, and I think that's a really important thing. Um, you know, uh, Humans are part of creation for sure, and not above it, and I think that is well, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for sure. I mean, I think that like you can see the ways that a lot of these ideas have become like very malformed within very reactionary types of Christianity. Um, Especially like I mean, like in Genesis. Okay, there's this whole current within Christianity about this thing called creation care, which is, I think, a very liberal way of thinking about ecology in the Bible for sure. But it is a reaction though to like Christian dominionism over like over Earth, right? The sort of like that God gives the Earth to people, and then like we can just kind of like exploit it however you want. And that's, I think a wrong way of thinking. But bound up in all of these kinds of questions of creation and like how you as a human kind of fit into it, I think the question of private property ends up becoming really central if you think about it kind of hard. Because yeah, I mean, like, what does it mean to really like to like own the earth, have dominion over it? Is it possessing it in a way that you can exploit it for your own good to the detriment of the entirety of the community? Like, no, that sucks. That's obviously not good. So like embracing that early Christian impulse that's kind of like against private property is maybe a first step for Christians to think through some of these environmental problems and like where they'll get you in the end.
Yeah, and not only the early Christian impulse, but all the way into Laudato Si itself,
Yeah,
right? Where
yeah.
Pope Francis like opens that saying that the church has never said that private property is an inalienable right, but that common destination of goods is sort of the controlling idea. Well, just to kind of keep on the Christian bit, maybe as we try to wrap this up, I was talking earlier about the imperialist piece of all this, that people in the global north, me, Matt, people who are probably listening to this podcast for the most part, we consume and live our lives in such a way that is enabled by exploitative and extractive practices related to the global south, right? That's probably news to nobody, I would guess. But the question is, like, what do you have to do about that? And I think this is actually a situation where Christianity and Marxism, again, surprise, I guess, hold hands. But, the podcast is called the Magnificast, and it comes from Mary's song called the Magnificat in Luke. And one of the lines in Mary's song is that the rich are being made low and the poor are being raised up. That's part of the kind of messianic dream of Jesus coming into the world. And I think about that a lot with things like imperialism, that in this sort of Christian way of thinking in Mary's Song of Liberation, the rich in our countries have to be made low and the poor in the global south have to be raised up, not in such a way that I think everybody gets cell phones or something, but in such a way that there's a radical reorganization of the global economy. And I think that is obviously a really ambitious kind of dream, a utopic thing to think about. But at the same time, it's important for us to have those kinds of conversations at that level too, because it's an intervention, I think, in certain conversations in the left, right? Like, I always think about the conversation around luxury space communism or whatever it is, that, the dream is that everybody will have an infinity pool on their rooftop or something. And that always really bothers me because in situations where people have really done socialism or really made a real effort, I guess is what I mean, really tried to do socialism, it has not meant infinity pools. It is hardly even meant public pools in some cases, right? That like countries are too poor to invest in these kinds of things. And it's important to think like Fray Beto does about Cuba, that socialism is a spiritual discipline, right? That it demands a certain kind of collective asceticism. And I think people in the global north are really going to have a bad wake-up call one way or the other. They're going to have a bad wake-up call through the basic result of climate change that will say you can't have cell phones anyway, you can't have cars anyway because the planet is on fire. Or we're going to have a wake-up call that we hear early enough to start making conscious decisions toward, not consuming in the way that we do and giving up the dream of having an infinity pool and everybody having a lawnmower and so on and so forth, and having to think seriously about collectivizing the things that we enjoy privately. So all that to say, I think there's a lot of good resources in kind of Christian ways of thinking about being in the world and renunciation, if you can do it in a healthy way, that sort of put us on a path to thinking in terms of socialism as well.
Yeah, that's a really good note. I mean, you're right, though. It is like, it's coming kind of one way or the other. And it is definitely about how you're going to create your disposition toward it, for sure. Like, I mean, climate change is here. Like, how we're going to deal with it is a conversation for right now. It's like luxury gay space communism, whatever. It's not, you're not going to have an infinity pool on your roof. Like, you're going to have like an agroecology project on your roof or something. Like, that's it. I mean, there's just like, there's no way out of the situation without drastically altering the patterns of production and consumption. And man, I would rather be making those decisions like in a participatory and democratic way than like letting a bunch of like fascists in the government do it for me. I mean, that's it. Those are the choices.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like we said this the last time we did the climate change episode, but I think it's important to recognize here too that people like Joe Biden, the Democrats and so on, or in my country, Trudeau and even the NDP, I mean, they are climate change denialist parties insofar as they're not working to collectivize our societies, right? They're not being proactive. They're holding on to a way of thinking that will not, it is literally not sustainable. It cannot be sustained. And I don't know. It's like, what do you do about all that? I do think part of it is like, go to church and let your imagination be formed, for sure, in such a way that puts you on a path to thinking in common and renouncing things. And the other part of it is like, go to your union meeting or like be out in the streets, you know? That's the answer to the end of every podcast that we ever do. But
yeah, exactly. I mean, there's just like so much organizing work to be done. And it is, I think, kind of overwhelming, but like people are doing it. I don't know whether it's like, you know, your union meeting, your whatever socialist formation meeting, your church, your like local, I don't know, like farmers group or whatever, man. Like it's all extremely important, and you can't neglect any of these things kind of moving forward.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. Go to your union. Go to church, plant a garden, wear your clothes 2 times in a row, and take less showers. I don't know. Take less showers, but also tell Joe Biden to, you know, be a communist. I don't know. What am I saying at the end here? I'm trying to think of a good sign off, but it's just not coming.
Take less showers is not a great one, but it's fine. I get it. Buy bulk seeds and store it in a mason jar in your garage.
Yeah, and don't let Monsanto know about them.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you support us at $2 or more, you can get access to the Lock-In, which is a behind the paywall podcast we do that we mentioned a couple times in this episode. It's a sillier vibe. There's goofy jokes, there's current events, and so on. So you can get that there. There's stickers and, I don't know, other stuff there. There's a Discord community that you can join if you want to talk about these monthly review articles, and we know that you do.
We're doing it.
We're doing it. There's a whole channel to do it. There's voice chat for people doing it. It's great. We're working it out one JBF article at a time. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong and the Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside what else are you